Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings of the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Johnson edition and we turn now to poem 721, Behind Me Dips Eternity. Now, this is what one scholar has said among the least accessible in the entire body of Dickinson's work. One scholar has called this a superbly terrifying poem, and one has called this a poem stark poem. And we're going to obviously ask why. Although, to be fair, there has been huge debate as well about how to interpret this poem. Scholars debate regularly. One scholar has considered this a brilliant example of Emily's material being somehow interpreted so radically and so differently. And again, that's why we call our study Chats with Emily. Now, I think standing behind this poem is Emily's reading of her favorite book from the King James Bible, the book of Revelation, especially the 8th chapter and the 7th through the 10th verse. So we'll begin there. The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth, and the third part of trees was burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up. And the second angel sounded, and as it were a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood. And the third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and the third part of the ships were destroyed. And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters. Now, when this poem was first published, it was in the London Mercury of February 1929. Now, our assumption is that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily's our playlist. We'll even ask maybe why we labeled our series Chats with Emily. A poem like this is one of those, with this little phrase that they say as being central to the reading of the poem. I'm hopeful as well that you've worked through the preceding 721 poems. If you've done that with us already, we just finished with 720, No Prisoner B, you'll be able to place this poem within the context of what some scholars have called Emily's flood subject. The question of afterlife. Okay, so Emily says, I'm here now. So what happens at my death or anyone's death? What is to come? That is to say, the dance between infinity or eternity and the idea of being immortal, immortality. Like, how does that work at all? Now, you'll maybe remember our study of 710, for example, and the way in which we kind of predicted that we would end up here. The sunrise runs for both. The east her purple trough keeps with the hill. The noon unwinds her blue till one breath cover two, remote is still. Nor does the night forget a lamp for each to set wicks wide away. The north her blazing sign erects an iodine till both can see. The midnight's dusky arms clasp hemispheres and homes, and so upon her bosom one and one upon her hem both lie. And then 2 poems later, 712, maybe Emily's most famous poem, Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves in immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the rain. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun, or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We passed before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice and the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Now, some have called this Emily's quest for a map. You might call it spiritual cartography between eternity and immortality. In some ways, one scholar, Washbush, has said it this way: we're allowed to see Emily thinking out loud. One of the reasons that we named our series Chats with Emily is that so much of Emily's stuff seems to play that game of Emily, as one scholar has said it, working at the very boundaries of human understanding. She's right on the edge, if you will. And I want you to notice how we'll move from the notion of eternity to the notion of immortality. We'll move from east, west, north, south. Behind me dips eternity. Before me immortality, myself, the term between. Death but the drift of eastern gray, dissolving into dawn away before the west began. 'Tis kingdoms afterward, they say, in perfect, pauseless monarchy, whose prince is son of none, himself his dateless dynasty, himself diversify, in duplicate divine. 'Tis miracle before me, then, 'tis miracle behind, between, a crescent in the sea, with midnight to the north of her, and midnight to the south of her, a maelstrom in the sky. Now, some of you will say right away, okay, this is a much more complicated poem than some of the others that we have worked with, which is why I make the argument to you guys that you can read Emily's stuff better if you place it within the context of a large number of previous poems. I mean, we are at 721 after all. And by this point, a couple of things right away. We're not going to be intimidated by the strange diction or even syntax of this poem. And we certainly aren't going to be scared away by Emily's challenge to herself to try to place herself somewhere in the, as we said, map of human existence. Notice we'll begin and end with the idea of behind and before. So what is it that she begins with? No pun intended. She'll say, behind me dips eternity, okay, in my past. Before me, that is to say, once I experience death, immortality. She'll use immortality, as we've already commented, in 41 of her poems. It's a subject she has great interest in. Myself, the present, now, the term between. Notice the idea of this present, that is to say, the term is the present. Now, it is interesting, one scholar has asked, does Emily consider herself or see herself as a child of God or something even less human? As one scholar has called it, an element in a cosmic equation, a term. Notice here as well, T.S. Eliot, I think influenced by a poem like this, as we've commented in our study of 4 quartets, all done at learnstrong.net. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is, what does he say, unredeemable? What might have been is an abstraction remaining a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation. What might have been and what has been point to one end which is always present, he will say in that set of lines to open 4 quartets in Bernard Norton. Notice here, she says, I'm the term in between, if you will. It's almost like an equation of a kind where you've got behind, you've got coming in the forward. And then we'll have the traditional Christian formula of death, of dying. Notice, death. 135 poems she references it. Death but the drift of eastern gray, dissolving into dawn away before the west begin. Notice here, we're talking east-west before we get to north-south at the end of the poem. In other words, this is what the Christian formula says. This is what dying is. Of course, you go from this thing called living to the thing called dying, and then beyond dying, well, you have again the drift, like the sunset, if you will. We've seen this so many times. Notice all the D sounds here of drift, dissolving, dawn. We'll pick up with other repetitions of sounds in a bit. Then a break. Then 'tis kingdoms afterward. Notice plural, not singular. Afterward, notice the use of the dash. They say, dash. Now, this they say is a brilliant construction because it isn't clear that Emily herself buys it. But she certainly was raised being told, no, this is what's coming after death. And so she calls it, they say. Of course, the antecedent to the pronoun they is always the question. They who say. And it's almost a throwaway phrase in some ways, because it almost seems as if there's a bit of skepticism possibly, or even doubt about the fact that there are kingdoms afterwards. And then notice all the P sounds. Imperfect, dash. Pauseless, monarchy capitalized, dash. Whose prince is son of none. Oh, well, this is interesting. Playing around, of course, with some biblical references here. Joshua, son of Nun. Here, the son of none, by the way, is capital N. Reminds us of Odysseus's proclamation. You'll remember that he is nobody when he in the Odyssey will reference to Polyphemus who he is. And of course it reminds us of poem 288 that we've already studied, I'm nobody, who are you? But here notice she seems to be suggesting that maybe Christ himself, the Prince of Heaven, the monarchy, the prince, is a son of none. Now, again, there's two different ways, obviously, to read that. One is obviously celebratory of Jesus Christ as being born of a virgin, and the story goes. But then there's the other side of it, the son of none. Himself, notice repeated 3 times. Himself, his dateless dynasty, back to monarchy. Himself, himself, diversify in duplicate divine. Is Emily suggesting that in the end, much like the Aristotelian view of deity that's navel-gazing, that God is somehow narcissistic, and all God can do is then look to himself. Notice that, again, P sounds, the D sounds being repeated here. Then, the final stanza. We're back to her speculations on where she stands as the term between these equations. "'Tis miracle before me." This is interesting, this idea of miracle, this maybe meaningless duplication, what scholars ask it. "Before me, dash, then, dash, 'tis miracle behind, dash," and then we're back to the between. "A crescent in the sea." Now again, it's as if she's now moving away even from her own self, and instead of talking in the first person, she goes to the third person of her. "With midnight," notice we go from miracle to midnight. "With midnight to the north." You'll remember midnight from 174, 425, and 461. We commented already on her use of that term, midnight. "To the north of her," notice again, we go from east, west to north, south. Of her, right? "And midnight to the south of her." Midnight, of course, representative possibly of the unknown. And then finally, "Maelstrom in the sky." Now this maelstrom, of course, takes us to our reading of Revelation 8, 7 through 10. You'll remember maelstrom when we did 4:14. Do you guys remember this one? 'Twas like a maelstrom with a notch that nearer every day kept narrowing its boiling wheel until the agony toiled cruelly with the final itch of your delicious hymn, and you dropped lost when something broke and let you from a dream, as if a goblin with a gauge kept measuring the hours until you felt your second way, helpless in his paws, and now a sinew stirred could help and sense with setting numb, when God remembered and the fiend let go, then overcome, as if your sentence stood pronounced and you were frozen led from dungeon's luxury of doubt to gibbets of the dead, and when the film had stitched your eyes, a creature gasped, reprieve, which anguish was the utterance then, to perish or to live. You'll remember when we did 502, the same. "At least to pray is left, O Jesus in the air. I know not which thy chamber is, I'm knocking everywhere. Thou settest earthquake in the south and maelstrom in the sea. Say, Jesus Christ of Nazareth, hast thou an arm for me?" And when we get to poem 872, one more time, we'll come back to this use of maelstrom. "As the starved maelstrom leaps the navies, as the vulture teased forces the broods, in the lonely valleys as the tiger eased. Be but a crumb of blood, fast scarlet, till he meet a man, dainty adorned with veins and tissues, and partakes his tongue, cooled by the morsel for a moment, grows a fiercer thing, till he esteem his dates and coca, a nutrition mean. I, of a finer famine, deem my supper dry, for but a berry of Domingo and a torrid eye." This idea of the maelstrom in the sea. Ultimately, when we get at the very end of our study, guys, at 17:12, we'll come back to this poem. We'll read it this way. "A pit, but heaven over it, and heaven beside it, heaven abroad, and yet a pit with heaven over it. To stir would be to slip, to look would be to drop, to dream, to sap the prop that holds my chances up. Ah, pit with heaven over it. The depth is all my thought. I dare not ask my feet. 'Twould start us where we sit so straight you'd scarce suspect it was a pit with fathoms under it. Its circuit just the same. Seed, summer, tune. Whose doom to whom?" Now, what are we going to do with a poem like this? Well, there are questions, obviously, in this poem about life and death. And obviously, those questions are often translinguistic. The scholar Priest has pointed out, and I want to share this with you, that scholars disagree on the meaning of this poem. Judith Farr, for example, claims the poem has an energy, suavity, vehemence, and exaltation that result in true majesty. She reads the poem optimistically as follows. 1. Emily is conscious There was an eternity behind her before she was born, and that immortality lies before her. Her present life is the term between. Her death will be a drifting away and a dissolving before the west of immortality receives her, and she enters the kingdom of heaven. As in the Nicene Creed, this kingdom shall have no end, is pauseless. Its prince, Jesus, is the only begotten Son of God, Son of none, begotten of his Father above all, before all worlds, dateless dynasty, and God of God, himself diversify in duplicate divine. So the miracles of eternity and immortality are behind and before her. Meanwhile, she is on the perilous voyage of life and on a crescent of the sea between the two, with midnight to the north and south and maelstrom in the sky. Roger Linden and Richard Sewell, on the other hand, see the poem as deeply pessimistic. They stress the words they say, as we commented at the end of line 7, and believe they indicate that the heaven of lines 7 through 12 described so negatively by Emily is for her nothing but speculation and fantasy, and that the last 3 lines of the poem contemplate the possibility of bleak nothingness as the reality of human destiny. Priest will finish by pointing out, no doubt readers will read the poem in light of their own beliefs. And I think that's significant. At 2B, the alliteration and the repetition is quite remarkable here. It's a fun poem to practice reading out loud. At 3A, well, again, we mentioned 1712. And then obviously we can think about our Dante's Divine Commedia that probably stands, I think, in Emily's mind behind this. We've given full lectures at learnstrong.net on the Divine Commedia. Finally, to own a poem like this at 3B, how do you read this poem? Do you read this poem optimistically? Do you read this poem pessimistically? And as Priest suggests, maybe it has a lot to do with your own personal views. I hope Emily's challenging you. Thank you.